This chapter is 1Kings chapter 10, and this particular time is during the time of King Solomon, who was the third king of Israel. And in all of Israel's history, this was probably the most prosperous, the most wealthy, the biggest, the best of anything that Israel ever had. And it shows what can happen during a time when God basically was ruling through Solomon here, because Solomon had asked God to help him out in this situation to rule these people, and this was part of the reason that Israel was so prosperous at this particular time. And in mankind's history, this was about 900 years before Christ came. We may wonder, well, what does this have to do with us now? This is 3,000 years ago. What do we have to be concerned about Solomon and his kingdom at that time? Well, Jesus made reference to it twice. Once in the book of Matthew. It mentions in Matthew 6 that Jesus was saying to don't take any thought about what you're going to be wearing. He says, take an example of the lilies. He said they don't toil and they don't spin, and yet they get clothed. And he says that yet Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like as to one of these. So here is Jesus making reference to this glory that Solomon had, and he compares it to a lily and says that there's nothing to be compared. Well, there was a picture being given there that during the time of Christ, people could reach completeness, which is what this little flower did. It grew up and it bloomed and it blossomed and it did all that it was able to do. Well, Solomon, he had a lot of glory, he had a lot of wealth and riches, but during his life, he could not reach the completeness spiritually that was available at the time of the early church. Yet in the picture that is given to us back here in Solomon, the very picture is of what was available at the time of the early church after Christ came and people were able to get this glory, depth of God's Spirit within their mind. That's what the picture is here at the time of Solomon. Well, the other reference, which is what is contained in this chapter, is in reference to an event that happened at the time of Solomon. This is about 20 years. He reigned for 40 years. This is about 20 years into his reign. And there was this lady that came up to visit him, this Queen of the South, as Jesus refers to her. And again, this is another reference that Jesus makes to this time period. And it's in reference to people not listening to what he has to say, not listening to the wisdom that's working through Jesus. He makes reference to a couple of prophets, one of them being Jonas. Jonas was this prophet, and he went to Nineveh, and he said the people listened to Jonah, and they repented at his preaching. And he says, a greater than Jonas is here, and the people wouldn't listen to him, they wouldn't repent. And then he goes on, he says, these men of Nineveh will rise up in judgment against you. And also, this Queen of the South, she came a great distance to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And these people wouldn't walk across the street to listen to Jesus preach and hear the wisdom that he had to say. And so he says that she will be a judgment against you. So it shows that people were being judged by events that happened prior to them even being born, because here was an example for them to learn by, that here were people that were interested. They were hungry to know something deeper of God, and it was available to them. A greater than Solomon was there, and yet they wouldn't take advantage of it. So here is an event that we see someone did take advantage of what God had to offer. So this is 1Kings chapter 10, verse 1. And when the Queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to prove him with hard questions. So the rumor had gotten out that there's somebody up here in this area called Jerusalem, and there's this King Solomon up here, and he's got quite a reputation going for himself. Part of it is because of this name of the Lord. Well, one of the things that is contained within this name of the Lord is understanding. And this is one of the things that was given to Solomon. And it started at the very beginning of his reign. He was in this city called Gibeon, and he had a dream. And in the dream, God asked him, said, ask what you want, and I'll give it to you. And Solomon says, well, I'm just a child, and I don't know how to come in and go out. And so this people is such a great people. What I need is understanding to judge this people and to discern between good and evil. And God says, because you haven't asked for long life or riches or the life of your enemies, because you've asked for this, I'm going to give you this understanding and this to discern judgment. And also, I'm going to give you riches and honor such as no king ever before you ever had and no king ever after you will ever have. So this is the fulfillment of that particular dream that Solomon had and the promise that God had made to him that he would have this. And we find out here that the main thing that this queen of the south is coming up to hear is this wisdom of God. So she comes up with these hard questions, and we don't know what these questions were, but a lot of us have had questions in our lives, and we've wondered things. We've wondered what we're doing on this planet, and we've wondered how we can get in contact with our Maker. There's a lot of things we've wondered about, and a lot of people we may have asked these questions of, and they didn't have the wisdom. They didn't have the answers. Verse 2, and she came to Jerusalem with a very great train, with camels that bear spices, and very much gold, and precious stones. And when she was come to Solomon, she communed with him of all that was in her heart. So when she got to Jerusalem, she was given audience. She came into town here with this long camel train, and it was loaded with spices and precious stones and gold. So she was bringing these presents up to Solomon, and her main reason for coming up here was to talk to this man. Verse 3, and Solomon told her all her questions. There was not anything hid from the king which he told her not. So here was a man that he got the questions asked to him, and if he didn't already have the answers by using the wisdom and searching things out that God had given him, God was able to supply him with the answer. Every question that she asked, the answer was given to her. Verse 4, and when the Queen of Sheba had seen all Solomon's wisdom, and the house that he had built, and the meat of his table, and the sitting of his servants, and the attendance of his ministers, and their apparel, and his cupbearers, and his ascent by which he went up into the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. So here she was amazed. She was impressed by the order that was going on in this kingdom. Everything was just working, and it was a very impressive thing that she saw here. And all her questions were answered, and she saw the magnificence of this kingdom that was around her. Verse 6, and she said unto the king, it was a true report that I heard in mine own land of thy acts and of thy wisdom. Howbeit I believed not the words until I came, and mine eyes had seen it. And behold, the half was not told me. Thy wisdom and prosperity exceedeth the fame which I heard. So she had heard the rumors, but she said to Solomon, she said, I didn't hear the half of it. I had no idea that the things that you have up here in Jerusalem, there was nothing to compare it to. There was no way to understand this. Well, we may wonder what's going on here. What is the picture? What is it that we can learn from this? And the idea is that at the time of the early church, it wasn't that the people had all these riches in the natural and all these things on the outward to look at, but there were people that came and they had these questions in their mind, and they were able to talk to people that had God's wisdom in their mind, and they were able to get some answers. And that's what this pictures here. This Queen of Sheba pictures someone from a lesser depth, and they're bringing whatever they have, their gold, their truths, the precious things that they've held on to in their life, they're bringing those up to Jerusalem, to a deeper depth of spirit. That's what was going on in the people's minds at the early church. They had the gold, they had the silver, they had the precious stones, they had the deeper truths, the order of God, the wisdom of God. And people could come to them and they could get their questions answered. And in this particular verse 7 here, where it mentions this fame, this word could have also been translated doctrine. Well, it was the doctrine of God that was feeding people's minds at the time of the early church, when people had questions about God, when they wanted to know something deeper, something to enrich their life by. They could come to someone that had God's doctrine, God's wisdom, and the answers were there, and their soul got fed. Well, that's the same picture that's going on right here. In verse 8, happy are thy men, happy are these thy servants, which stand continually before thee, and that hear thy wisdom. So the queen knew that the people were content. They were happy with the way this kingdom was being run. It was a glorious time in Israel's history. There was peace all around. The first time ever. For 40 years, Solomon reigned. His very name means peaceful. And here was a 40-year period of peace where there was no wars. On every side it was rest. And Solomon had this affinity with all these different kings all around him. And there was no fighting going on. It was a continual time of building. Well, that's what can go on when God He's already got some of the battles won. On the doctrine side, He can start to do some building within people's minds. And that was what was going on at the time of the early church. Christ had done some battling in His life. That's what was pictured by David, Solomon's father. Christ had done the battling against evil, and He had the answers, and He put those answers in the apostles' minds. They became the foundation of the early church, and they were able to do greater works than Christ. And Solomon did greater works than David. It's the same picture. It's bringing these lesser depths into the deeper depth and bringing these truths on up. And it's God is blessing this entire nation here, and it's the same way in the spiritual realm at the time of the early church. when people had God's wisdom, God's depths, God was blessing them, and they were very happy. Verse 9, Blessed be the Lord thy God, which delighted in thee to set thee on the throne of Israel, because the Lord loved Israel forever. Therefore made he thee king to do judgment and justice. So here the Queen of Sheba knew that God had a hand in what was going on here. It wasn't just Solomon's idea to get put up here as the king, but God had set this king up. It wasn't originally God's plan to even have kings. God had intended for Israel to have judges, but they decided they wanted a king, and so they chose the first king, which was Saul. But here we have a couple kings in a row here, David and Solomon, that God put in this position, and because they were listening and honoring God, worshiping God at this time, then God was able to work through them, and he was blessing the kingdom. The minds of the people were being blessed, and here the credit is being given to God that is ruling over Israel at this time. Verse 10, And she gave the king 120 talents of gold, and of spices very great store, and precious stones. There came no more such abundance of spices as these which the Queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. So in this entire period of time that Solomon was reigning, there wasn't any amount of precious spices that came into Jerusalem as what was brought up by this Queen of Sheba. And she also brought these gold and these precious stones. So we may wonder what, this Queen of Sheba pictures somebody that has a lesser depth coming to a deeper depth. What is it that they can bring and give to someone that's in a deeper depth? Well, the answer is that people have had truths. They've had precious things in their life. They've had faith. They've had different things of God within their mind. But they're still searching for something deeper. They're still looking for that deeper wisdom of God. And they can give that to the deeper depth, and it can be blessed and multiplied. And as we see here a little bit later on, they get something back in return for it. So this bringing of these lesser depth truths, it's not that you lose something. There's a whole lot to be gained here by this. And the example in the natural is very much like we see now, where a foreign ruler will come into the country, and he'll bring a gift, and the ruler of that country will give them a gift, and there's this exchange of gifts. So this is what is going on at this particular time. Verse 11, And the navy also of Hiram, that brought gold from Ophir, brought it from Ophir great plenty of almug trees and precious stones. So here's another situation that's going on. Solomon had a real knack for making treaties and affinities with other nations, and he already had made an affinity with the Pharaoh. So he had his kingdom spread pretty wide here, and this one particular man here named Hiram is called here, he's also called Hiram in other places. He was the king of Tyre, and this was a seacoast city where these men were very skilled in navigating, and one of Solomon's leagues that he made with these nations was with this man named Hiram. And this man supplied a lot of the material that went into building this temple and the houses that Solomon built. He supplied these materials. And we may think, well, what does this guy have to do with it? He wasn't even an Israelite. Well, there are ways that God has of working to build the temple that we may never think of. And this particular man here and these Sidonians that he was in charge of, they were hewers of timber, and these navigators, they were able to work to supply materials to build this temple in the natural. But spiritually, it pictures a particular group of angels that are able to help people within their lives to figure out what it is that's not allowing them to get the temple built within their mind. It's a process that God has of revealing how evil works within a person's mind. And it's a very similar picture to other things that happen in Christ's ministry. One of them being, we're probably familiar with the story of when Christ rode into Jerusalem and he was riding upon an ass, and the foal of the ass, and the people laid their clothes down, and the disciples laid their clothes on the ass, and he rode into town. Well, it's a very similar picture that there are these mysteries, these hidden things in the Bible that picture something spiritual, picture something very deep. And there are angels that God has that work for him, not just the holy angels. There are angels that sinned, they followed Lucifer, and they repented of that condition that they were in, and now they're working for God. And so if we've ever wondered, like it says in the book of Psalms where it says God sent evil angels among the people, how can God do this? How can God send an evil angel? If they were really one of Lucifer's angels, they wouldn't listen to God. They're disobedient. They would disobey him. If he told them to go somewhere, they'd say, no, I'm going the other direction. Well, these angels that are pictured by Hiram here, they're working for God. And what they're doing is that they're stirring up the evil that's keeping God from doing the work of building within their mind, and that's going to help get this temple built. And so this man Hiram here, he supplied a lot of material here. And these particular trees, they went into building, it's kind of like a banister around this terrace that was in the temple. And it says here that there was no other trees the size of these trees that ever came into Jerusalem. So this man was busy. He was supplying a lot of material, and he was running the navy, more or less, that Solomon had, that went out and did all this commerce between these other nations. Verse 12, And the king made of the almug trees pillars for the house of the Lord, and for the king's house harps also and psalteries for singers. There came no such almug trees, nor were seen unto this day. So out of these particular trees that were brought, there were these banisters made. If you interlace this with the book of 2 Chronicles, it's the very same story. It calls it a terrace rather than a pillar here, which the terrace would be this elevated place, and there was a banister around this, and that's what they used these trees for, and also they used them in the making of these musical instruments. So it is by repentant angels being able to help a person to strip off any evil in their life that God is able to make them into an instrument in His temple, someone that can be able to preach and teach God's words, as it says in the book of Revelation, to sing this song of Moses and of the Lamb. So this is the way these angels are working. They're helping people to get rid of evil in their life so that they can become part of God's temple. Verse 13, And King Solomon gave unto the Queen of Sheba all her desire, whatsoever she asked, beside that which Solomon gave her of his royal bounty. So she turned and went to her own country, she and her servants. So this is the end of whatever report we have about the Queen of Sheba here, this Queen of the South, and it shows that she had a good relationship here with Solomon because she had came and heard this wisdom of Solomon. So the rest of this chapter gives a little bit of the understanding about how great this kingdom was, how much prosperity there was at the time of Solomon, and we know in Solomon's own writings that he looked at everything he had done in his life and he considered it vanity, and that he came to the conclusion that there's only one thing to do in this life, and that's to fear God and to keep His commandments. So it wasn't this gold and all these riches that Solomon had that he considered to be the wealth. The wealth that he considered was the words of God that he had within his mind. And so it is that if we look at these things in the natural, we need to bring it over to the spiritual and to apply this to the things that God gives us within our mind, which is exactly what this pictures. It pictures the riches that people had after Christ came and left this information, this precious truths within people's minds. So in verse 14 it says, Now the weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold. So there was a lot of gold in Jerusalem. 15, Beside that he had of the merchantmen and of the traffic of the spice merchants and of all the kings of Arabia and of the governors of the country. 16, And King Solomon made 200 targets of beaten gold. 600 shekels of gold went to one target. So these targets were shields, and back then the shields were used in fighting. At this particular time, they weren't in these wars, so what did he have to do with all these shields? Well, it tells us in the next verse here. And he made 300 shields of beaten gold. 3 pounds of gold went to one shield, and the king put them in the house of the forest of Lebanon. So he had several houses around it, so he just hung these shields of gold up in his houses. So he had a lot of gold shields. Here it mentions 200 in one verse and 300 in the next verse. And if we look in the New Testament, we can find out what the shield pictures in the book of Ephesians. It tells us about the spiritual armor that we're to put on. And it says that we're to have this shield of faith, which will be able to quench all the fiery darts of the wicked. So here's some shields made of some precious substance, and we bring that into what the early church had. We can know that they had a lot of faith, a lot of precious faith, and there wasn't any fiery darts, there wasn't any evil words coming at them that was going to shake up their faith. And that's the picture we have here of these shields being made of this beaten gold. And the beaten shows this process, this trial process that we go through, just as Peter mentioned, that your faith is more precious than gold that is tried in the fire. So now we get into the picture of what Solomon ruled on here. The next few verses shows this elaborate throne that he sat upon. Verse 18, Moreover, the king made a great throne of ivory and overlaid it with the best gold. So this best gold, it just means pure gold. If you interlace it with Chronicles, it says it's the very same thing. It just calls it pure gold. So he took some very pure gold and he made this elaborate throne out of ivory. And it describes this throne in the next few verses here. Verse 19, the throne had 6 steps, and the top of the throne was round behind, and there were stays on either side of the place of the seat, and 2 lions stood beside the stays. 20, and 12 lions stood there on the one side and on the other upon the 6 steps. There was not the like made in any kingdom. So here was a throne that had these 6 steps, and then there was a 7th step where this seat was that Solomon sat upon, and it had these armrests on it. It was all made out of ivory, and it was all overlaid with gold, and there were these 12 lions that lined the sides of this throne as you went up. So it was quite an elaborate thing that Solomon had built here. And spiritually, it does have a picture for us, and these numbers that are mentioned here, the fact that there are these 6 steps and the top one being the 7th, it shows that God has these levels of understanding that He wants us to move into. And it's not unusual to look through the Scriptures and find that these numbers appear in different places. Like in the book of Genesis, we find out that there are these 7 days that God mentions, that He did a certain work on this day and that day, and on the 7th day He rested. And then we go over to the book of Hebrews and we find that there remains a rest for the people of God. And as God labored, that we also must do this labor. And so there are pictures throughout the Bible. In the Old Testament, He sent the children of Israel out to gather manna for 6 days, and on the 6th day they were supposed to gather enough for the 7th day to carry them on through. So here's these pictures over and over of these 7 steps, these 7 days of creation that God has for us to move into, and that's what these steps on this throne picture. And then you look at the front of this throne, and here were these lions that went up the steps, more or less, one on either side, and there was 12 of them. Well, there are some keys in the Bible that let us know what a lion is, and we have to use a little interpretation to find out which key to use, because in one place it says that the devil is a roaring lion, walketh about seeking whom he may devour. But we know that that's not the right picture here, because this is something good. So we can look over in the book of Revelation and find this little key tucked away here where it calls Christ the Lion of the tribe of Judah had prevailed to open these seals. So here is Christ, and it shows the warring side, the battling side. So it pictures people being able to work for a warrior in God, and the fact that there's these 12, well, there's another number that appears a lot within the Scriptures, and it's just very plentiful. We know that Christ had 12 disciples. We know that on the breastplate in the Old Testament there were these 12 stones in the breastplate. You go back to the book of Revelation, you find out that this spiritual city, New Jerusalem, that it talks about had 12 gates, and there's 12 foundations to this city, and there's 12 stones in these gates. Well, and then at the very end of the book, there's this river of life that proceeds out of the throne, and there's these 2 trees on either side bearing 12 manner of fruits. Well, what is this 12? Well, it shows that God has these works that He does. He has works of righteousness, work of truthfulness, works of contentment. And so these lions picture these warriors working in these different works. And it doesn't matter whether it's angels, invisible spirit creatures, or whether it's people on this earth that get this material in their mind. As Jesus said, that concerning people that resurrect in their life, He said they're equal to the angels. And they don't die anymore. They've got the same material in their mind. They're able to fight just like these angels do and work within these 12 works. So that's what this throne pictures, is something that God can rule through and move us up through these creative days and to fight within these works, help to overcome evil. Verse 21, and all King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were of pure gold. None were of silver. It was nothing accounted of in the days of Solomon. So there was so much gold around that they didn't even bother to make things out of silver. There wasn't any need to mess with it. It was good. Silver is a good picture in the Scriptures, as in places where it makes comparisons of precious things. Silver is something that doesn't get burned up, but it is of a lesser value than gold. And we find out also in the book of Revelation, in the 3rd chapter, that Jesus says, I counsel of you to buy of me gold tried in the fire, so that you can be rich. Well, Jesus never went around selling gold in the natural. But here it is, in the Old Testament, Solomon had all this gold. So it pictures, in the New Covenant, what people had within their mind, the things of God that were very precious, the faith, the love, the joy, the contentment, all these things of God. It was His celestial substance. It was His deep productive spirit. And there was lots of it within the people's minds after Christ came and left this blueprint, this way to get into this deeper creation of God, get this heaven of God within their mind. And there was plenty of gold to go around at the time of the early church. And the fact that it was pure, it shows that it had been tried by fire. It had all the impurities burned out of it. It's God's Word that can go within our mind. If we have anything that needs to be cleaned up in our substance body, our love or our joy, if there's anything perverted in that, God's Word will point that out, and we can get it purified, and we can be pure gold within our mind. Verse 22, for the king had at sea a navy of Tarshish, with the navy of Hiram. Once in 3 years came the navy of Tarshish, bringing gold and silver, ivory and apes and peacocks. So it looks like Solomon just got just about anything that was to be gotten back at this time. He had these navies going all over the country and coming up from Africa and different places and bringing in gold and silver and ivory. And here it mentions these apes and peacocks. So he had quite a variety of things coming into Jerusalem. Well, if you picture what was going on at the early church, God likes variety, and he had a lot of different operations going on in people's minds, and Paul mentions this in the book of Corinthians in the 15th chapter about how there's these different kinds of flesh. There's flesh of fishes and flesh of beasts and flesh of birds, and they're all a little different, but they're all good. Well, that's what this picture's here, is all these different mixtures of track operations, God's Spirit moving through gifts at the time of the early church. It was a pretty glorious sight in the natural, and it was a pretty glorious thing spiritually to step into a house at the time of the early church and hear these gifts in operation, and hear God's Spirit moving through, feeling this wisdom of God, feeling these precious truths of God. That was a pretty glorious thing. 23. So King Solomon exceeded all the kings of the earth for riches and for wisdom. So it was just like God had said. He asked for the right thing, and God said, I'm going to give you more than you asked for. And so it was. There was no king that ever had the glory that Solomon had. Verse 24, and all the earth sought to Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put in his heart. So this is a very important scripture to let us know that Solomon wasn't born with this wisdom. It wasn't already within his mind. It says here that God put that in his heart. So he had asked for it, and God was able to give him this wisdom. And because he had this, when people came up to Jerusalem, that was the primary reason for coming up there, was to hear this wisdom of Solomon. And it says all the earth sought Solomon. Well, it doesn't mean every person on the face of the earth, but over in 2 Chronicles 9, which is the sister scripture to this, it says the kings of the earth sought the presence of Solomon. So these kings are people that are in positions to sow out words to other people. And so the fact that it's the kings of the earth, God uses these locations as a picture of his depths of spirit. As he says in the book of Isaiah, as the heaven is higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways. So these kings of the earth would be people just like this Queen of Sheba. They were in lesser depths, and they heard about somebody that had this deep knowledge, this deep wisdom. Let's go up here and ask. Let's go up here and inquire from this man. Let's get some of this wisdom in our mind. So it was that people would come from all over the earth to hear this wisdom of Solomon. And it says here in 25, and they brought every man his present, vessels of silver and vessels of gold, and garments and armor and spices, horses and mules, a rate year by year. So here was all this commerce and all these gifts coming in to Jerusalem at that time. It was just a time of extreme prosperity. Everything that you could imagine, the magnificence of this kingdom, there never was anything on the earth that exceeded it. 26, and Solomon gathered together chariots and horsemen, and he had 1,400 chariots, and 12,000 horsemen, whom he bestowed in the cities for chariots, and with the king at Jerusalem. And then over in 2 Chronicles it mentions a little bit more that's not mentioned here in Kings. It says, and he reigned over all the kings from the river, even unto the land of the Philistines, and to the border of Egypt. So this shows the extent of Solomon's kingdom that he ruled over, and he had more chariots than he knew what to do with. He had chariots and horsemen everywhere. 27, and the king made silver to be in Jerusalem as stones, and cedars made he to be as the sycamore trees that are in the vale for abundance. So here, there was silver. It was just like going out and picking a rock up off the ground, he says. There was so much of it. And the cedars, which is a picture of ceiling. It's a wood that doesn't rot. It's a very good, precious wood. That's what Solomon used to line the inside of the temple with. He had these huge stones that were quarried and brought in. Said there was no hammer heard when they built this temple of God that was so magnificent. And they lined the entire temple with cedar, and then they overlaid that with gold. So it was a very magnificent building that Solomon had built here. 28. And Solomon had horses brought out of Egypt, and linen yarn. The king's merchants received the linen yarn at a price. And a chariot went out of Egypt for 600 shekels of silver, and a horse for 150. And so for all the kings of the Hittites and for all the kings of Syria did they bring them out by their means. So here it is, the things that were coming into Jerusalem. One of the things that mentioned here was this linen, and there is a key in the book of Revelation that tells us that this fine linen is like the righteousness of the saints. So this is linen coming out of Egypt. Well, Egypt is also a picture for us. That's where God drew his people out of. He brought them out of Egypt, and he brought them up here to Jerusalem as a picture of bringing people from this lesser depth into a deeper depth. So if we've had any righteousness in our life in a lesser depth, we can bring it to Jerusalem. We can get it into this deeper depth. And so Solomon's glory was very well spoken of by Christ. He knew what it was, but it was in the natural. It only lasted about 400 years before they came in and took all the gold away. And we know that God has a plan, and in one of the scriptures in the Old Testament, it says that the glory of the latter house will be greater than the glory of the former. And that was in reference to this temple that was destroyed at the time of Solomon. And yet that temple, this original temple, never stood again, but they came back and they built a temple that was greater. Well, that's also a picture for us to let us know that when people came at the time of the early church to hear the truths of God, it was a very glorious time. And those things got tore down for a while. They got lost. But God says, look for this greater temple that's coming, because the glory of it will be greater than this former house.